Reading Marcovaldo, or The Seasons in the City, by Italo Calvino. Winter 12. The Wrong Stop. For anyone who dislikes his home and finds it inhospitable, the favorite refuge on cold evenings is the movies. Marcovaldo had a passion for Technicolor films on the wide screen, which can embrace the most vast horizons, prairies, rocky mountains, equatorial forests, islands where you live with a garland around your head. He would see the picture twice, and he never came out until they were closing the theater. And in his thoughts he continued living in those landscapes and breathing those colors. But the return home in the drizzling night, the wait at the stop for tram number 30, the realization that his life would know no other setting beyond trams, traffic lights, rooms in the half-basement, gas stoves, drying laundry, warehouses and shipping rooms made the film's splendor fade for him to a worn and gray sadness. That evening, the film he had seen took place in the forest of India. Steam rose in clouds from the swampy undergrowth, and serpents slithered along the lianas and climbed up the statues of ancient temples swallowed up by the jungle. Coming out of the theater, he opened his eyes at the street, closed them again, reopened them. He saw nothing. Absolutely nothing. Not even in front of his nose. In the hours he had spent inside, fog had invaded the city, a thick, opaque fog which engulfed things and sounds, flattened distances into a space without dimensions, mixed lights into the darkness and transformed them into glows without shape or place. Marcovaldo headed mechanically for the stop of the 30 tram, and banged his nose against the signpost. At that moment he realized he was happy. The fog, erasing the world around him, allowed him to hold in his eyes the visions of the wide screen. Even the cold was muffled, as if the city had pulled a cloud over it, like a blanket. Bundled up in his overcoat, Marcovaldo felt protected from every external sensation, suspended in the void, and he could color this void with the images of India, the Ganges, the jungle, Calcutta. The tram arrived, evanescent as a phantom, slowly jangling. Things existed just to the slight extent that sufficed for Marcovaldo, staying at the rear of the tram that evening, his back to the other passengers, as he stared beyond the panes of the empty night traversed only by undefined luminous presences and by an occasional shadow blacker than the darkness, offered the perfect situation for daydreaming, for projecting in front of himself wherever he went, a never-ending film on a boundless screen. With these fantasies he lost count of the stops. All at once he asked himself where he was. He saw the tram was now almost empty. He peered out of the windows, interpreted the glimmers that surfaced, decided his stop was the next, ran to the door just in time, and got out. He looked around, seeking some reference point, but the few shadows and lights his eyes could discern refused to form any known image. He had got off at the wrong stop and didn't know where he was. If he met a passerby, it would be easy to ask him the way. But whether because of the loneliness of this place, or because of the hour, or the bad weather, there wasn't a shadow of a human being to be seen. Finally he saw one, a shadow, and waited for it to come closer. No, it was moving away. Perhaps it was crossing the street, or walking down the middle of it. It might not be a pedestrian, but a cyclist, on a bicycle without a headlight. Marcovaldo cried out, Hey, mister, please, can you tell me where Via Pancrazietti is? The shape moved farther away, was now almost invisible. That way. But there was no telling which way he had pointed. Right or left, shouted Marcovaldo, but he could have been addressing the void. An answer came, the wake of an answer, left. But it could also have been right. In any case, since there was no seeing which way the other man faced, right and left meant nothing. Now Marcovaldo was walking towards a glow that seemed to come from the opposite sidewalk, a bit farther on. But the distance proved to be much greater. He had to cross a kind of square, with a little island of grass in the middle, and arrows, the only intelligible sign indicating that traffic had to keep right. It was late, but surely some cafe was still open, some tavern. The sign he was just beginning to decipher said, bar. Then it went out. On what must have been an illuminated window, a shaft of darkness fell like a blind. The bar was closing, and it was still. He seemed to understand at that moment, very far away. So he might as well head for another light. As he walked, Marcovaldo didn't know he was following a straight line, if the luminous dot he was now heading for was always the same, or had doubled or trebled or changed position. The soot, a somewhat milky black within which he moved, was so fine that already he felt it infiltrating his overcoat, as if through a sieve, between the threads of the cloth which soaked it up like a sponge. The light he reached was the smoky entrance to a tavern. Inside there were people seated or standing at the counter, but because of the poor illumination or because the fog had penetrated everywhere, even here forms seemed blurred, like certain taverns you see in the movies, situated in ancient times or in distant lands. "I was looking. Maybe you gentlemen know where it is for Via Pancrazietti?" he began saying, but there was noise in the tavern, drunks who laughed, believing him drunk, and the questions he managed to ask, the explanations he managed to obtain, were also foggy and blurred. Especially since, to warm himself, he ordered, or rather he allowed the men standing at the counter to force on him, a quarter-liter of wine, at first, and then another half-liter, plus a few glasses which, with great slaps on the back, were offered him by the others. In short, when he came out of the tavern, his notions of the way home were no clearer than before, though in compensation the fog was more than ever capable of containing all continents and colors. With the warmth of the wine inside him, Marcovaldo walked for a good quarter of an hour, with steps that constantly felt the need of stretching to the left and to the right to gauge the width of the sidewalk, if he was still following a sidewalk, and hands that felt the need to touch continuously the walls, if he was still following a wall. The fog in his thoughts as he walked was gradually dispelled, but the fog outside remained dense. He remembered that at the tavern they had told him to take a certain avenue, follow it for 100 yards, then ask again, but now he didn't know how far he had come from the tavern, or if he had only walked around the block. The spaces seemed uninhabited, within brick walls like the confines of factories. At one corner there was surely the marble plaque with the name of the street, but the light of the lamppost suspended between the two lanes didn't reach that far. To approach the words, Marcovaldo climbed up a no parking sign. He climbed until he could put his nose on the plaque, but the letters had faded, and he had no matches to illuminate them better. Above the plaque, the wall ended in a flat, broad top, and leaning out from the no parking sign, Marcovaldo managed to hoist himself up there. He had glimpsed, set above the top of the wall, a big whitish sign. He took a few steps along the top of the wall, reaching the sign. Here the streetlight illuminated the black letters on the white ground, but the words, "Access to unauthorized persons strictly prohibited," gave him no enlightenment. The top of the wall was so wide that he could balance himself on it and walk. Indeed, when he thought about it, it was better than the sidewalk, because the street lights were high enough to illuminate his steps, making a bright stripe in the midst of the darkness. At a certain point the wall ended, and Marcovaldo found himself against the capital of a gatepost. No, the wall made a right angle and went on. And so, what with angles, niches, junctures, posts, Marcovaldo's route followed an irregular pattern. Several times he thought the wall was ending, then discovered it continued in another direction. After so many turns, he no longer knew what direction he was headed in, or rather, on which side he should jump. If he wanted to move down to the street, jump. And what if the height had increased? He crouched on the top of a column, tried to peer down on one side and the other, but no ray of light reached the ground. It might be a little drop of a couple of yards, or an abyss. The only thing he could do was continue advancing up where he was. The avenue of escape was not long in appearing. It was a flat surface, a pale glimmer next to the wall, perhaps the roof of a building, of cement, as Marcovaldo realized when he began to walk on it, which extended into the darkness. He immediately regretted having ventured onto it. Now he had lost all reference points. He had moved away from the line of streetlights, and every step he took might bring him to the edge of the roof, or, beyond it, into the void. The void really was a chasm. From below, little lights glowed as if from a great distance, as if those were the streetlights down there. The ground must be much lower still. Marcovaldo found himself suspended in a space impossible to imagine. At times, up above, the red and green lights appeared, arranged in irregular figures, like constellations. Peering at those lights with his nose in the air, he soon took a step into the void and fell headlong. "I'm dead," he thought. But at the same moment he found himself seated on some soft earth. His hands touched some grass. He had fallen unharmed into the midst of a meadow. The low lights, which had seemed so distant to him, were a line of little bulbs at ground level. A peculiar place to put lights, but convenient all the same, because they marked out a path for him. His foot now was not treading on grass, but on asphalt. In the midst of the meadow, a broad paved street passed, illuminated by those luminous beams at ground level. Around him, nothing. only the very high colored lights which appeared and disappeared. A paved road is sure to lead somewhere, Marcovaldo thought, and started following it. He arrived at a fork, or rather at an intersection, where every branch of the road was flanked by those little low bulbs, and huge white numbers were marked on the ground. He lost heart. What did it matter which direction he chose to follow if all around there was only this flat grassy meadow and this empty fog? It was at this point that he saw, at a man's height, a movement of beams of light. A man, really a man, with his arms open, dressed, it seemed, in a yellow overall, was waving two luminous little discs like the kind station masters wave. Marcovaldo ran towards this man, and even before reaching him, he started saying breathlessly, Hey, listen, here in the midst of the fog, how do I... Don't worry, the voice of the man in yellow replied. Above 1,000 meters, there's no fog. You can proceed safely. The steps are just ahead. The others have already boarded. The words were obscure, but heartening. Marcovaldo was particularly pleased to hear there were other people not far away. He advanced to join them without asking further questions. The mysteriously announced steps were a little stairway with comfortable steps and two railings, white in the darkness. Marcovaldo climbed up. On the threshold of a low doorway, a girl greeted him so cordially it seemed impossible she was actually addressing him. Marcovaldo bowed and scraped. My humble respects, Signorina. Steeped in cold and dampness as he was dazed at finding refuge under a roof. He entered, blinked, his eyes blinded by the light. He wasn't in a house, he was... where? In a bus, he thought. A long bus with many empty places. He sat down. As a rule, going home from work, he never took the bus, but chose the tram because the ticket cost a bit less. This time, however, he was lost in a neighborhood so remote that surely there was only a bus service. How lucky he was to have arrived in time to catch this one, no doubt the last, and what soft, comfortable seats. Marcovaldo, now that he had found out about it, would always take the bus, even if the passengers were obliged to obey some rules. Please, a loudspeaker was saying, refrain from smoking and fasten your seatbelts, even if the roar of the motor as it started was excessive. A man in uniform passed among the seats. Excuse me, conductor, Marcovaldo said. Do you know if there's a stop anywhere near Via Pancrazio Pancrazietti? What are you talking about, sir? Our first stop is Bombay. Then we go on to Calcutta and Singapore. Marcovaldo looked around him. In the other places were seated impassive Indians with beards and turbans. There were also a few women wrapped in embroidered saris, a painted spot on their brow. The night beyond the windows was full of stars, now that the plane had passed through the thick blanket of fog and was flying in the limpid sky of the great altitudes.